Pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslodum, bloco asfo da terra do bacalhau.
Oi, tudo bem? Welcome to the 6th lesson in the special series I've created to help you to jumpstart your Brazilian Portuguese. I'm Professor Jason, and today I'll be teaching you how to form and say numbers, and how to use those numbers to quantify objects, to talk about dates, ages, phone numbers, time, and prices. Now that's a lot of uses, but numbers obviously are super important. I can't guarantee it'll be a short lesson, but I'll do my best to keep things clear and simple. Então, vamos começar. Let's get started. So let's take a look at our lesson overview. First thing we're going to do is present the forms of the numbers. You'll be able to see how they're written. You'll hear how they're pronounced. And then I'm going to go into talking about several of the most frequent or common uses for numbers, the cardinal numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. First of all, we'll look at talking about quantity, say how much or how many of something a person has. We'll also talk about dates, although we saw that in the previous lesson, just touch briefly on that, as well as ages. How do you ask someone how old they are or tell someone how old you are? Also really briefly touch on phone numbers. Spend a little bit more time on how to ask and tell the time. And finally, another really common use of numbers is to ask about or to tell or to give prices. And then we'll wrap up the lesson by looking at ordinal numbers. Those are the numbers like 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 7th, 9th, 21st, etc. And I'll give you some examples of how those are used in Brazilian Portuguese. Alright, so on the next few slides, I'm going to go through the numbers 0 or 0 to 2 billion. But don't worry, I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. I'm going to sort of go through maybe the first 20 or 30 or so, and then I'll skip around and try to highlight certain things about the numbers. So, let's start. 0, or uma, dois, duas. You'll see there's a masculine and a feminine form for 1 and 2. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11, 12, 13, 14, as they say in Brazil, or 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Okay, so now let's look at how to build on those numbers higher than 20, but still in the tens and the low hundreds. So if I want to say 21, I take the word 20 for 20 and just add and 1. 21 or 21, 22 or 22. Remember, there are feminine forms for numbers 1 and 2. 23 and so on. 24, 25, etc. 30 is 30, so I would do the same thing. Take the form 30 and say e and then add the number. 31 or 31, 32, 33, 34, etc. 40 is 40, 50, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 is 100. Nasal sound. 100. So if anything after 100, between 100 and 200, I have to say 100 So 101, 101, 115, for example, 115, 120, 122, or 22, 144, 144. Finally, 199 would be something like this. 199. Alright, so now let's move on to some larger numbers. 200 or 200, 300, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900. 1000 is 1000. 1100 would be 1100. 1200, for example, would be 1200. So 1,233, the 1,233, 1,865, 1,865, 1,980, 1,999, and these last three I put on here, or last four really, because they're dates we might use. So 1999. In Portuguese, as in Spanish, you can't say dates in that form, 1999. You have to say 1,999 would be 1999. Finally, 2000, 2000. And then this final slide in the sequence has some even bigger numbers. 2013, 2100, 2555, 5,000, you would of course have 6,000, 7,000, 8,000, 9,000, and then 10,000, 15,000, 100,000, 100,000, 100,000, 1 million, 1 million, 1 million, 2 million, for example, 2 milhões. I wanted to show you the different plural form of milhão, milhões, 2 milhões, 3 milhões, 25 milhões, for example, 1 billion or 1,000 million, bilhão in Brazilian Portuguese, bilhão, 2 billion again to show the plural form, 2 bilhões. Alright, now there's a couple things that I want to point out about numbers, about writing them, and even saying them, that are different than what you might expect if you're used to the English forms. So for example, notice that in Brazilian Portuguese, when you have large numbers, right, the billions, millions, hundreds of thousands, periods are used rather than commas to separate billions, millions, and thousands. So a number like 1,500,250,000 does not have commas with periods to separate. Similarly, I guess, or maybe the reverse of that, is that where in English we would use a period to indicate a decimal point, in Brazilian Portuguese they use a comma or vírgula for that purpose. So something like 35.08% in Brazilian Portuguese is 35,08%. Another thing that's interesting is the use, and something that you have to keep in mind and be careful about, is when to say E, when to insert the conjunction E or an in numbers in Brazilian Portuguese, because the rules are a little bit different than in Spanish. The basic rule is that you do insert it between the hundreds, tens, and ones. So 199 is 199, 199, 235, 235. So we're inserting the conjunction E between hundreds, tens, and ones. Now, you don't insert it immediately after thousands, millions, or billions. So we would say 1,248 or 2,350. So we're not inserting the E right after thousands, millions, or billions, unless, when we're dealing with thousands, unless what follows the thousands is an even hundreds unit or more than one zero. So look at these examples. 1,100, 1,100, 2013, put that one in because it happens to be the year, 2013, or 4,002. So there I am inserting the conjunction E. Now in longer numbers, the conjunction E is inserted between hundreds, tens, and ones, but is omitted between billions, millions, and thousands. So let's take a look at a longer number. 4,345,222. 4,345,222. Okay, now what I'm going to do throughout the rest of the lesson is introduce a few types of tasks or ways to incorporate numbers, ways that numbers are used in everyday kinds of speaking. So the first of these is going to be probably the most obvious, and that's talking about quantity. And by that I mean asking someone or telling somebody how much or how many of something you have or they have. Now this involves the use of quanto, which means how much or how many, and there are masculine forms and feminine forms, singular, plural forms. So the forms are quanto, quantus, quanta, and quantas. Okay? So the formula to ask somebody how much they have is to say, for example, if I want to know how much money somebody has, I would say, quanto dinheiro tem, and then the person's name, right? Or I could say, quanto dinheiro você tem, right? And the person would answer by using the verb tem, usually the form tenho, if they're talking about themselves, eu tenho, or if they're talking about somebody else, like Bill Gates on this slide, or Angelina Jolie, they would use the form tem. The form of the verb haver, a, can also be used with quantity when you're talking about the existence of something. So, quanto dinheiro tem, or quantas pessoas há no mundo. So let's look at some example sentences here, and notice I've highlighted in yellow the agreement between this quantifier quanto and the objects that I'm asking about, the quantity. So how much money does Bill Gates have? Quanto dinheiro tem Bill Gates? Quanta proteína tem ovo? Quantos filhos, plural, quantos filhos tem Angelina Jolie? You know the answers? Think about the answers. I'm going to show you on the next slide. I did my homework. Quantos veículos há em São Paulo? So again, that form há, quantos há, just means how many exist, how many are there. Quantos veículos há em São Paulo? You know how many cars there are in São Paulo? Quantos anos você tem? How old are you? We'll get to that in more depth in a minute. Quantas páginas tem esse livro? How many pages does it have? Quantas páginas tem esse livro? Quantas casas vocês têm? Quantas pessoas há no mundo? So I'm asking about quantity, how much or how many. Let's look at some answers. Okay, and as promised, here are the answers to those questions, just in case you're curious, but I wanted to show you the structures for answering them, the grammatical structures, and also how the numbers are used in the answers. So, quanto dinheiro tem Bill Gates? Ele tem 72 bilhões de dólares. Quanta proteína tem ovo? Tem 6 gramas. Quantos filhos tem Angelina Jolie? Ela tem 6 filhos. Quantos veículos há em São Paulo? Há mais de 6 milhões. So more than is mais de 6 milhões. Quantos anos você tem? You would just say your age. Eu tenho, then the number, then the years. Eu tenho 40 anos. Quantas páginas tem esse livro? Now listen closely, because páginas is a plural feminine noun. Tem 302 páginas. 302 páginas. Quantas casas vocês têm? Temos 2 casas. Temos 2. Feminine. Quantas pessoas há no mundo? Há mais de 7 bilhões de pessoas no mundo. Há mais de 7 bilhões. Another really common use of numbers, at least the numbers 1 through 31, is to talk about dates or birthdays. And the note on this slide says to see the previous lesson, that would be lesson number 5, because that lesson deals in a lot more detail with this topic, talking about dates. But just as a reminder, right, we would ask something like, qual a data de hoje? Or, que dia é hoje? Hoje é dia, and then the number. Hoje é dia 6 de outubro. Que dia é hoje? Dia 31 de março. Or I can ask when a certain event will take place. Que dia é a prova? É no dia 25 de novembro. Or, que dia é a festa? É 9 de abril. Quando é o seu aniversário? When's your birthday? Quando é o seu aniversário? É dia 5 de abril. And of course, we're also going to use numbers to talk about ages, at least the numbers 1 through maybe like 115 these days. This is a formulaic question. It's always asked and answered in basically the same way. So the formula for asking it is quantos anos, and then você if I'm asking you directly, and then tem. Or if I'm asking about someone else, I might say quantos anos, how many years, quantos anos tem, and then the person. Okay? So, quantos anos você tem? Person might answer, tenho 30 anos, or tenho 30. Quantos anos tem seu pai? How many years does your father have? How old is your dad? Ele tem 55. Ele tem 55 anos. Another way to ask this question, which is also formulaic, is qual é a sua idade? Ou qual sua idade? If it's heard in faster speech, less formal. Tenho 25 anos, or just 25 anos. Qual é a sua idade? Quantos anos você tem? Tenho 44 anos. Now, another common use where numbers obviously come into play is with telephone numbers. And I'm not going to do a detailed presentation on telephone numbers. It's a simple, how do you ask someone their phone number and give your phone number. The question, the formulaic question is something like, and there are many variations, but qual é o seu número de telefone? Or qual é o seu telefone? You might answer by saying, meu número de telefone, or meu telefone é, and that é is a form of the verb ser, to be. So you're saying, my phone number is. Meu número de telefone é, and then you just say the numbers. 541-726-0961. Now you're hearing me say meia. That's because in Portuguese, when you have a number 6 in a phone number, another number that you're reading off like that, they say meia, which stands for meia dúzia, or a half dozen, 6, to avoid, I think, confusion with between seis y tres. Right? Seis y tres, talvez. That's my theory. I guess that might be right. So again, é 541-726-0961. Qual seu número de telefone? Meu número de telefone é 417-649-1285. It doesn't really matter how you group up the numbers. I'm giving kind of American numbers as an example. Qual seu número de telefone? É 417-649-1285. All right, another major use of numbers is, of course, asking and telling time. There are numbers all over this task. Now, this might be sort of a complicated task to try to insert into this lesson, but I'll try to go through it quickly. It might be an instance where you need to rewind and go through this section in more detail. It probably deserves a lesson of its own, but I decided to include it because of it's numbers heavy. Again, it's a formulaic question and answer. When you want to ask what time it is, it's que horas são, que horas são, que horas são, and you answer by saying são, and then the number, são 8, and then the conjunction e, the minutes, and if you want to add for clarity, da manhã in the morning, da tarde in the afternoon, da noite, da madrugada. Da noite is at night, right? So we can say on this little clock, I might say, que horas são? São 8:10 da manhã. If it's 1 o'clock, and I'll get to this, repeat this in a second, you would say, é 1:20. So if somebody asks me, que horas são? And it happens to be 4 o'clock, 4 in the morning, I would say, são 4 horas da manhã. If it's 8 o'clock, são 8 horas on the dot, or exactly, em ponto. São 8 horas em ponto. If it's 11, são 11 horas. São 4 horas da tarde. You'll see in writing, right, they use 24-hour time. Brazilian Portuguese speakers do. But they might in speech say, são 4 horas da tarde. 2300 hours, 11 p.m. São 11 horas da noite. Now what about 9:10, 9:15, adding minutes? Like I said, you just use the conjunction and then say the number for the minutes. São 9:10. São 9:15. São 9:30. Again, half hour. São 9:40. Or I could say, são 20 para as 10. Para as 10. 20 minutos para as 10. 9:45, são 9:45. Or, são 15 para as 10. 9:50, são 9:50. Or, são 10 minutos. São 10 para as 10. So I try to give you a bunch of variety on this side so you can kind of extrapolate and figure out what you might say at different times. A couple more notes on the telling time use of numbers. If it happens to be anywhere in the 1 o'clock hour between 1 and 2, instead of saying são, you're going to say é. So, que horas são? É 1:00. It's 1 o'clock. 1:15, é 1:15. 1:30, é 1:30. 1:40, I could say, é 1:40, or são 20 para as 2. São 20 para as 2. At 12 o'clock, if it's midday, if it's noon, é meio-dia. If it's midnight, é meia-noite. É meia-noite. Now, beyond just telling time, using numbers to tell time, sometimes you need to say what time something is, what time something starts. This is, again, a formulaic type of structure. The question is either a que horas, and then the verb and the event, as in, a que horas é a festa, or a que horas começa o filme, but many times you don't hear the a, and it's just que horas, okay? Que horas começa o filme? Que horas você trabalha? Que horas passa a novela? What time do they show the soap opera? And then the way to answer this, you can see in yellow, is usually you have the verb, whether that's the verb ser, it's at 10, é às 10, or it begins, começa às 4, and then the hour and the minutes, and then optionally in the morning, in the afternoon, at night. A que horas é a festa? É às 10. Or I could leave off the verb and just say, às 10, às 10. Que horas começa o filme? Começa às 4, 4:30. Or I can just leave off the verb again and say, às 4:30. Que horas você trabalha? Às 9 da manhã. Que horas passa a novela? What time is the soap opera on? Às 8. Às 8 da noite. Okay, so the final usage that we'll look at for cardinal numbers is very important to you ladies out there, the shoppers, and that's to ask and to give prices. So you might be in a market and want to ask how much is that t-shirt, or whatever the case may be. Again, we're looking at very formulaic language in this lesson. Another example right here. To ask how much something costs, the phrase is quanto custa, and then the object, or the verb, if it's a verb like to rent a car, right? Quanto custa? And then you answer by saying custa, then the amount, or the number, and then the unit, the currency. Reais, which is the Brazilian currency, or dólares. Okay? So some examples. Quanto custa carro no Brasil? How much does a car in Brazil cost? They're expensive. Custa mais de 80.000 reais. Taxes are very high, I've been told. Quanto custa essa camiseta? You might ask in the market. Essa camiseta, quanto custa? Custa 135 reais. Quanto custa alugar apartamento no Rio? How much does it cost to rent an apartment in Rio de Janeiro? Quanto custa alugar apartamento no Rio? Depende do bairro. Depends on the neighborhood. Mas sai caro. Sai caro means it's expensive. Então, quanto custa alugar apartamento no Rio? Depende do bairro, mas sai caro. Another helpful structure or way to approach prices is to ask basically the equivalent of, how much did you pay for that? Right? So we're using the past tense here, but we only need to remember two forms. Pagou and paguei, I paid. So, how much did you pay for that? Quanto você pagou por? And sometimes you might hear them use the preposition em instead. And the person responds, paguei, the number, and then the currency. Quanto você pagou pelo seu iPhone? Pelo is a contraction of por and the article u, right? Quanto você pagou pelo seu iPhone? Paguei mais de $500. Quanto você pagou pela sua casa? How much did you pay for your house? Paguei $350.000. Quanto você pagou na sua câmera? Here I'm using the preposition em, in, plus the object, or excuse me, the article a. Quanto você pagou na sua câmera? But I could say pela sua. Paguei só $55. I only paid $55. Paguei só $55. So again, I'm using past tense forms here. Quanto você pagou? What did you pay? Eu paguei. I paid. A third way to talk about prices and a third structure to use, a third formulaic structure, has to do with asking people how much they pay for a service, and usually like in a given period. So for example, how much do you pay in rent? How much do you pay? What's your gym fee every month? Or what's your internet fee every month? Formula here would be quanto você paga de, and then the expense, or sometimes em, and the expense. Person responds, eu pago, then the number, then the currency, reais, dólares. Quanto você paga de aluguel? That's rent. Quanto você paga de aluguel? Pago R$2.000 por mês. I don't really need the por mês, that's kind of obvious, but pago R$2.000. Quanto você paga de academia? That's a gym fee. Quanto você paga de academia por mês? Pago R$180. Quanto você paga na mensalidade da internet? Pago R$60. E você? Mensalidade would be a monthly fee, a monthly subscription. Quanto você paga na mensalidade da internet? Pago R$60. E você? And you? So we've looked at some of the most frequent and common uses of the cardinal numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. Now I just really quickly want to end this lesson with just a quick glance, superficial look at ordinal numbers. Ordinal numbers are the ones that we use to order things, to talk about the sequence or succession of things. And so you can see them on the screen here. First is primeiro or primeira, segundo, segunda, terceiro, terceira, quarto, quarta, quinto, quinta, sexto, sétimo, oitavo, nono, décimo. And we could go on, but usually first through 10th is going to be sufficient. So just some quick examples of these in usage. If I wanted to say, today is the 6th day of the strike, hoje é o 6º dia da greve. Hoje é o 6º dia da greve. The 6th day. Brasil é o 5º maior país do mundo. Brasil é o 5º maior país do mundo. The 5th largest country in the world. The third use I have here highlights the fact that the days of the week, the weekdays, right, Monday through Friday in Brazilian Portuguese, use ordinal numbers, feminine forms. Não quero trabalhar na segunda-feira. Não quero trabalhar na segunda. And then, if a date is the first of the month, just like in English or Spanish, ordinal numbers preferred. Seu aniversário é 1º de outubro. Seu aniversário é 1º de outubro. Alright, that's it for Lesson 6 in my Basic Brazilian Portuguese course. Hope you found this information on numbers and their many uses to be clear, informative, and useful. If so, please share it with others and be sure to let me know if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, okay? As always, thanks for watching and be sure to catch Professor Jason's next lesson. I'll see you then. Até breve. Ciao.
Eu vou pra Oslo, pra sair no Oslo.